Hi everyone, I'm Michelle from michellesmidheaven.com, and today I want to share an example of an enclosure. An enclosure is what happens when a planet is trapped by either both of the so-called benefics, Venus and Jupiter, or both of the malefic planets, Mars and Saturn. And in this video today, I'll present a chart that has a malefic enclosure. Just to clarify, malefic doesn't mean evil in a moral sense. Malefic planets are destructive as opposed to the benefic planets that are conducive to life and growth. But this has nothing to do with morality. It's just that we happen to live in this reality that consists of endless cycles of death and rebirth, not only for human beings, but for absolutely everything. Everything in the sublunar realm is born or created and then grows and blossoms for a while until it starts to deteriorate and finally make room for something else, for a new beginning. The planets describe these processes. From our standpoint as human beings, however, Jupiter and Venus as the benefic planets describe the parts that unfold more easily, while the malefic planets Mars and Saturn are disruptive and describe the parts of the process that might require more effort. Now, before I share a chart sample with you, I'm going to explain what an enclosure is and how we can spot one in the chart. All right, here we go. Well, by the way, sometimes you'll hear this technique referred to as besiegement, and that is the medieval word for enclosure, but it's the same principle. If we focus on Mercury in this chart for a minute, we see that Mercury is at 24 degrees of Libra, and Jupiter is at 23 degrees of Sagittarius. And Jupiter is casting its ray, or in other words, Jupiter is making an exact sextile to 23 degrees Libra. At the same time, we see Venus here at 27 degrees Sagittarius, casting a ray to 27 degrees of Libra. And this means that Jupiter's ray lands right behind Mercury, while Venus's ray lands just before Mercury, as Mercury is making its way through the zodiac in a counterclockwise motion. So this means that Mercury is enclosed by the benefics, and generally we would think that Mercury and everything that Mercury represents in this chart will probably go very well for the native. So mercurial stuff like speaking and writing and the ability to learn and the general intellect of the native will be experienced as being very positive. And for example, in this particular chart, Mercury is ruling the 11th house of friends and allies, and also the second house of livelihood, possessions, finances. So we can say that the native probably will feel very supported in these two areas of life. Now let's take a look at this other example and focus on the moon in this chart. We have the moon at 10 degrees Taurus here, and we can see Saturn casting a ray to 8 degrees Taurus just behind the moon. And Mars is also casting a ray that falls just in front of the moon at 12 degrees Taurus. So at first glance, it looks like the moon is enclosed by Mars and Saturn. However, we have another planet here who is breaking up this malefic enclosure by intervening with a ray. Look at Venus here. Venus can see the moon through a trine aspect. Venus is at 11 degrees Capricorn, casting a ray to 11 degrees Taurus, which falls right between the moon and Mars's ray. So Venus jumps in front of Mars, so to speak, effectively intervening in what would otherwise have been an enclosure. I also wanted to show you a chart example of a bodily enclosure. This is actually much simpler to see, probably, even if we have to make sure that there is no intervention, that no other planet is sending its rays to break up the enclosure. And that's exactly what happens here. You see, at first glance, it looks like the moon is sandwiched here between both of the benefics. However, Mars at 7 degrees Aries sees these planets by a square, so it is casting a ray to 7 degrees Cancer, and thereby breaking the benefic enclosure. And finally, here we are. Here's a chart of Henri Charrière, who was born in a village with an extremely long name in France in a little over 100 years ago. And he's known for his novel, Papillon, which is a memoir of his time as a prisoner in a penal colony of French Guiana, from which he eventually escaped. I planned to do a really short video on this chart, but then I found Henri's life to be so fascinating that I just had to tell you a little more about it. So when Henri was only 11 years old, his mother died, and he never really recovered from that. And we can see this in several places in the chart. First, we see the moon as a natural significator of the mother in the 12th house. And the 12th house has to do with loss. And the moon is the ruler of Cancer, and Cancer is in the 8th house of death. Death also shows up with Saturn's placement here in the 4th house of home and family. Now, Henri himself is indicated by Venus and Mercury because they're in the 1st house, or the helm of the chart, but also by Jupiter, because Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius, the sign in the 1st house. So the 1st house speaks to the character of the native. And I imagine Henri to have been warm and friendly, an easygoing, cheerful guy who loved to laugh and maybe talk a lot as well. And maybe someone who enjoyed bouncing off ideas, sharing them with friends, and so on. However, the ruler of the helm, Jupiter, is not in the greatest spot over here in the 8th house. We know the 8th house to be the house of death, although for ancient astrologers, it was the 7th house that was the house of death, as that is where the sun sets, where the day comes to an end, and so will all of us one day. Planets in the 8th house have a lot to do with fear of death and the judgment that we will receive when we die. The 8th house tells us not only about our fears, but also about the way we deal and cope with these fears, or the attempts that we make to escape judgment, to escape our own fate, you could say. And with this freedom-loving, restless, and exalted Jupiter in Cancer in Henri's chart, we can expect a certain amount of rebelliousness that comes from a deep emotional state caused by the loss of his mother, which probably sparked a lot of unbearable feelings and sensations. More importantly, though, this Jupiter is enclosed by the malefics, and to have such an important planet as a ruler of the helm besieged by the malefics, that must be tough on the native on several levels, as it's like being between a rock and a hard place. And growing up, he became more reckless and aggressive. And finally, when he was 17 years old, his father didn't want to deal with him anymore, and he sent him to the French Navy. During the time he spent in the Navy, Henri was pretty stubborn and defiant, and he was disciplined for that. They placed him in a section where he was basically spending his time cleaning and doing the laundry. We can see his time in the Navy as the sun in Scorpio, the water sign of Mars, the warrior god. And around this time, he got a tattoo of a butterfly on his chest. Butterfly in French is papillon. And this was to become his nickname as well as his demise, as we'll see later. And of course, later on, it also became the title of his popular autobiography. Anyway, he was supposed to spend 3 years with the Navy, but soon he had enough of it. And after 2 years, he actually crushed one of his thumbs just to get out of there. That tight square here between Mars and Jupiter, that is not only a great representation for having a tattoo on your chest, the chest being Cancer. This square is also really bold and courageous and risk-taking with these two planets involved. So Henri gets out of the Navy and moves to Paris, and he works here and there, nothing steady, but he does get involved in petty crime on the side. Nothing huge, though. Now, in March 1930, when Henri was 23 years old, a man was shot and brought to the hospital. And before he died, he was able to tell the police the name of his murderer. He said, and I'm translating, Butterfly Roger. However, it was Butterfly Henri who was arrested by the police. And I've got the transit chart of the time of the murder, and we can see how the natal promise around this enclosed Jupiter is activated by an actual repetition of the enclosure pattern of the natal chart through the transits. His natal Jupiter is now enclosed by the transiting malefics. He denied having anything to do with the murder, but he was sentenced to life in prison and 10 years of hard labor in a penal colony in French Guiana. And that's a really tough sentence. He was captured after he tried to escape, and he was put into solitary confinement for 2 years. That's incredible, right? So here's how this enclosure of the helm ruler becomes very literal. Jupiter, as the ruler of the first house, represents his body, his enclosed, imprisoned body. And 8 years later, he escapes again, and he manages this time to flee to Venezuela, where he starts a new life. It's only later in his life that he writes down his memoirs in his novel, Papillon, certainly also inspired by many stories of his fellow prisoners. And he writes a compelling story that became a bestseller. He was criticized, though, because he didn't always stay true to the facts, but I guess those people didn't realize that his Mercury in Sagittarius has more important things to do than to stick to the minute facts. This man is an adventurous storyteller, wouldn't you say? This man doesn't want his enthusiasm to be limited by details. And he told these stories with a lot of emotion and a very evocative and soulful way he had to explain his memoirs. Well, a couple of movies were made based on this book as well, by the way, so check that out if you're interested. Well, that's it for me in any case. And I hope you enjoyed this content. And if you did, please give this video a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. I've got more charts for you in my monthly new moons letter, to which you can subscribe if you go to my website, michellesmidheaven.com. And of course, as always, I'd love to hear your comments. Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, everyone. Bye for now.